Welcome to the continuation of our weekly conversations as part of our spring season of programming here at the Playwrights Center. These conversations are part and parcel of everything that's going on right now, and we do want to make sure, I'll mention it again, Julia, maybe you can pop it up in the chat window, but we do want to make sure that if you're interested in joining for seminars, workshops, classes, articles that you want to read, or certainly our online reading series. We are in a month into it now and things are going really, really well, but we'd love to have you join us for more things. So please do check us out at pwcenter.org to learn more about the spring season programming. I know that we have folks tuning in online from all around the country to be with us today, and I just want to send everyone big love and health right now in the middle of this crazy, uncertain moment. We are here at the Playwrights Center gathering to tell stories and to listen to artists and to follow them. Artists have been our great leaders for so long, like Marvin, and we are really excited to be sharing some of these conversations and having moments like this today. I'm Jeremy Cohen. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the producing artistic director here at the Playwrights Center, and thank you for joining us today. We're so grateful that you're choosing to spend some time this afternoon with the amazing Marvin and also me. Before we dive in, just a few bits of business. Julia went over a little bit of this, but since there's new folks joining us, I'm seeing now as well, just to welcome you and let you know how the structure of this conversation will go. So the question of can we hear you or see you, we can't, but we will once we get to the question and answer portion in a little bit. So you'll be able to, as you can do right now, is see and hear both Marvin and myself, and then we'll get to you guys in a little bit. If you have any trouble at any point, you can just use the chat function and chat privately to Julia, and then she'll do her best to help you out with anything you need. To let you know, we are recording the conversation today, so these public conversations are an opportunity for us to increase our ability for inclusion and access for more folks who can't join at a specific time or can't access the conversation in the same way, but this gives us a conversation to an opportunity to go back to this conversation in time. So if you know folks that have wanted to hear what we talked about today, there will be a link afterwards that you can do that as well. And so basically the structure today is that we're going to talk, Marvin and I are going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to reserve the whole last piece of the conversation to take questions from you. At that point, and I'll explain this again, if you look at the participants tab at the bottom of your screen, you can use the raise hand function. Julia is then going to kind of put people into a queue and then kind of say like, hey, it's time for Carrie to ask a question. And then we will unmute you. And then you can go ahead and be in conversation with us directly rather than typing it out online. So I will repeat that again when it's time to do that. One thing I just want to note about this spring programming as we're sort of calculating and planning still and all of it's going on is that we're looking at continuing all of this at least through June and definitely somewhat into the summer as well. We know that by the time we hit, we've gotten probably not even all the way through May, we will have been able to create over 200 new paid compensated contracts for playwrights, actors, directors, dramaturgs, etc. And that's been really critical for us from the very start before we even left the building properly, which is how can we keep freelance artists employed right now in some kind of way. So thank you to the staff and thank you to all of the artists who have stepped up to say like, yes, please pay me for my work and leadership right now. And we're excited to do that. So today we are so fortunate to have with us the one and only Marvin González De León. Marvin is a Chicano playwright and an educator. He was a 2018-19 Many Voices Fellow, and he is currently in his first year of 3 years as a core writer at the Playwrights Center. He's also currently a member of the 2020 Interstate 73 Writers Group at Page 73 Productions. Big shout out to P73, who are amazing doing new work in New York. And Marvin received his MFA in dramatic writing from Arizona State University, where he is also a part-time instructor in the Film, Dance, and Theater School. So Marvin, welcome. Hello.
Jeremy, how are you?
You know,
good to be here.
I'm in a pandemic and it's apparently Tuesday, Marvin. I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I'm in my house with animals and a teenager, so I'm okay, you know. You know, Marvin, I think kind of each week, each day, and kind of frankly for me, each hour kind of going through this moment together is obviously, as you and I have been talking about as friends and colleagues over the last month, teaching us all sorts of new ideas and understandings of how the world actually works. And I think for us at the center, for everyone at home, we're spending a lot of our time, almost all of our time, talking about how we're a service organization, an artist service organization. So how can we kind of lean into those muscles we've been developing over the years as a true service organization in terms of supporting artists, their work, their lives, the entire package. And that's kind of partially what we want to talk about today, is how do we see a whole person who is an artist, and how will that person live and thrive and move forward in vocational life in the theater field going forward. On the other hand, in addition to kind of the vocational life, we're all humans. And so I think as I certainly am, beginning to really face our own fears, our own frailty, our hopes, our uncertainties right now. We are looking to where we find hope. We are looking to where we find inspiration, and also where we feel some of that anxiety. And I think for us at the center, even more so, we're now seeing this as a time where, Marvin, in the case of you, we are really looking to our artists to be at the center of conversations right now. Artists are obviously these sort of brilliant, scrappy, expressive thinkers and storytellers who have been living these lives and doing this work and demonstrating their leadership throughout the ages. And now it's time to lean back in and listen and learn. So with all of that said, though, we've known and we continue to learn, Marvin, as we've been talking about, that there's many people in our country, in our world, who are even more deeply affected, certainly more vulnerable in the systems of inequity that have been built. A lot of people on this call certainly have spent years talking about and working on new ideas for change and for seeing some of steps forward through these systems of inequity. But at the same time, a moment like this, we continue to reveal just how deeply and pervasively these systems exist. And so it felt really critical, as we're talking and having these beautiful moments of spirituality and art making and all the other stuff, that in addition to that, that we continue to reveal just how deeply and pervasively these systems exist, and to go back to the beginning, to acknowledge, sure, how far we've come in certain ways, but much more importantly, I think, to acknowledge how far we still have to go. So we asked writers what they wanted to talk about right now, and Marvin, this is a conversation that you and I very much wanted to have today, and I really appreciate your willingness to be able to talk together today about this.
Right.
So I want to start us off by saying, obviously in this conversation, you are just hearing from Marvin and I in this first moment. And then of course, these are just our opinions that we're expressing here today, and that we're really looking forward to opening up the conversation with all of you in a few minutes. So I'm going to kick us off by saying, Marvin, I have spent the past couple of years getting to know you, and I have loved at least 96.4% of those moments, Marvin. You know that you are.
That's a pretty good track record.
Thanks. It's a good track record. Not everyone gets that 0.4. I'd love it. One of the ways when you first moved to the Twin Cities that we all got to know you is you started talking about your sort of origin story a little bit, what your life experience has been. And I'm wondering if you can start us off by kind of just sharing personally, if you're willing, kind of where, how did you kind of start out as a person? How did you start out as an artist? And like, what is the pursuit of a career as an artist meant for you? And what's that look like?
Yeah, and I think that I just want to start off by saying, like, looking at the list of impressive people that are on this conversation, that I'm probably not like the most qualified person to talk about inequity in America. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an economist. I minored in economics in college, but I'm not sure that qualifies me for it. However, the reason I like just feel passionate in talking about this, and there's so much like good news, not good news, but like inspirational news that you're hearing coming out of this pandemic and what people are doing at home to sort of keep the spirit of humanity alive. And it's been very inspiring. I also feel that we need to continue to have this conversation of thinking about where we're going to be in the future, and not, taking our eye off the ball about inequalities that exist, because it's most likely going to get worse. So I felt like it was a part of like my personal story of just growing up, you know, in a small town in northeastern Nevada, to parents who were immigrants from Mexico. My dad was like a rancher. You know, my mom was, she worked as a janitor. She worked in like hospitality. She worked in like as like a maid in the casinos up there when I was a little kid. And sort of just like not growing up from a place that was sort of where there was even theater at all, where there wasn't like satellite schools where if you were a gifted student, you could, you know, sort of get a leg up to like getting to college or any of that stuff. And just sort of like feeling that like my adult life has been punctuated by, you know, one crisis after another. I was like a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. I had just graduated from undergrad in 2007. And I was in Nevada, and that wasn't when the financial crisis happened, but that was right when the subprime mortgage crisis happened. So I basically, and Nevada was the state that was the most affected by it because of all the house flipping and all that was going on in Vegas. So I just sort of like graduated right at this time with like no skills and no job experience under my belt, like in the worst state you could possibly be in, like mentally, but also like physically, like Nevada was the worst state to be in at that time. And just like sort of thinking about how that pushed the brakes on like the aspirations I'd had as an idealistic youth in terms of like what I wanted to do as an artist. And I actually never envisioned myself being a playwright. So actually, you know, but when I was a kid, I wanted to be like a writer. I wanted to be a novelist. And I had like really high aspirations to do that. And then, you know, I graduated from college and like the financial crisis happened, and, you know, that sort of like kind of pumped the brakes on going to grad school, getting my PhD, moving to a bigger city where I could be around more literary types. All the things that I thought I needed to do to sort of advance that career, like just got put on hold. And then just to speak, you know, candidly, like I didn't respond to it, to like that financial crisis, just like not being able to find a job and not being able to pursue the things that I'd always wanted to pursue ever since I was a little kid. That like, you know, that leads you to sort of like making bad decisions, like abusing drugs and all that sort of stuff, and how all of those things sort of ramify and have lasting effects on your life, you know, the decisions you make in dark times, right? So part of why I really wanted to have this discussion is because I started thinking about, you know, who are like the 22-year-old, you know, kids that come from like low income backgrounds that are like in college right now, who, you know, who are now going to face, because this is a health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. So it's who are now going to have to put on hold, you know, their aspirations to go, you know, a job in the arts might not seem like the best thing to pursue right now when you need to take care of your family. So it's like they might forego, you know, taking those early steps of like getting their art career started to do something that seems a little bit more practical and more functional to support their family. Who like now going to getting their MFA in playwriting might not seem like it's even a possibility because of the financial hardships they're about to experience. So I started to think of, you know, because in my case, it stunted my growth, and then I sort of got back into it later in life, getting back into the arts. But I don't think that that's necessarily everybody's trajectory. I think a lot of people got sidetracked by the financial crisis, a lot of artists, and then never sort of came back to pursuing that passion. So I think that that's likely going to happen to a lot of people. You know, the COVID crisis is going to lead to a lot of artists, a lot of young artists who are like having to make those hard decisions. So I started to think about like, who are all these like unheard voices that, you know, are just gonna, or these voices that had the potential to be heard, but now because of this, you know, may not be. And sort of thinking about my own personal history and as it relates to what's going on right now, that was sort of what sort of just inspired me to like, we need to have this discussion. We need to be talking about inequality on all different levels, and, you know, talking about income inequality and wealth inequality, and how those things are tied into, race and ethnicity, in, historically and systematically in this country is sort of like, to me, it's like the sort of most important conversation to have right now, because in crisis like this, there's already a lot of inequality, and a crisis like this, the inequality is going to increase. So we just need to be prepared. We need to be prepared for that reality as a community of artists. So, yeah.
Marvin, can you talk, just a moment ago, you sort of were talking a little bit about income inequality and wealth inequality. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those things in your mind, and how you see, and really specifically, how do you see that play out?
Yeah, well, yeah, it got me thinking about the last financial crisis that we had, and how we talk about income inequality a lot, but we don't talk about wealth inequality. And that's really where there's like a bigger gap, because certainly the incomes from like the top earners to like the bottom earners, that gap has been increasing, steadily, at least for the last 50 years, even more drastically than it was before. But it's also people's wealth, and we don't think about that. So for middle income people, their biggest source of wealth is actually in owning a home. And so in the last financial crisis, it was directly tied into home ownership, right? But for the top earners, the top 10%, the majority of their wealth is in the stock market. So it got me thinking about how quick people are able to recover the wealth that they lose in economic crises like these. So for middle income people, the housing market didn't recover till a lot longer than the stock market recovered. So for the people on top, the last financial crisis, while it did hit the stock market and a lot of people on Wall Street lost their jobs, the stock market bounced back really quick. It had effectively come back to where it was by 2013. And by mid-2009, the financial sector was already earning 25% of what it was in 2007. So it's a lot quicker of a response, and it's a lot faster response for people on top. What their wealth actually is, what their wealth actually looks like. And then for the people at the bottom, all you have is your job. And when the jobs are, if you look at the data for people that are low income earners, the amount of money that they were making just prior to this current crisis was like less than it was before the crisis, or the last financial crisis. Whereas for top earners, they were the only sector of society, the like top 10%. They were the only segment of society that's making more money post the 2008 financial crisis than they were before. So it's just like a way of the way that, like, not only is it that that salaries aren't going up and all that sort of thing, but the thing that we actually, extract wealth from in the society is also an unequal thing that favors the top earners versus people in the middle, and then completely ignores everybody who's on the bottom, which is like a huge segment of society. And just thinking about like people my age, I'm basically like an elder statesman millennial, but how the last financial crisis prevented us from moving into this bracket of actual wealth. So I might be making more money than my parents did, but I don't own a home, and they'd already owned a home by this point in their life. So thinking about how just from generation to generation, it's harder now to actually acquire wealth in America. So even with wages being stagnant, that's only half of the discussion. The other half is like, well, how do people actually make money in this country? And it's not just from your job.
Can you talk a little bit, you mentioned it a moment ago, and without, overgeneralizing or extrapolating too far, but you started talking a little bit about, sort of an increase in racial inequity and inequality, both in kind of as a result of that recession and as a result of some of that wealth inequality. Can you talk a little bit about if you're if you are feeling like there's a correlation there, or kind of where that goes for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you mean whether there's a correlate? I'm sorry, you kind of broke up there for a second. But do
Oh,
you mean
sorry. Yeah, just you know, as you're talking about sort of wealth inequality in particular, do you feel like we saw? I'm answering the question as I'm asking it, but do you feel like correlatively we saw a real increase in racial inequality as well?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's when you look at like what middle income earners were making, and like the stats that I've seen is like before the last financial crisis, the average white family, the median income for an average white middle class family was $180,000 a year. And it was about $80,000 a year for a Latinx, median income for a Latinx family, and then median income from an African American family was $65,000 a year. So you can see, like, prior to the Great Recession, there was already a huge gap in wealth inequality in the country, just looking at the middle class. And that doesn't even take into consideration how many people in the lower income brackets, how much they were suffering at that time in terms of like the disparity of wealth in this country. Well, after, you know, I'm looking at the stats. There was a low point in 2013, was sort of the low point of like wealth post the last recession. So at the lowest point, on average, white American family was making $132,000 a year versus that $189,000 that they were making prior to it. Whereas for a Latinx family, that had gone down to $38,000 or $39,000 as opposed to the $85,000 they were making before. And that was $33,000 for the average Black family versus the $65,000 they were making before the recession. So that's once they recovered, white families bounced back. So by 2016, they were making about $150,000 median income for a white family. And then Hispanic families were at 46,000, Black families were at 39,000. So the amount of like the disparity of the wealth just in that middle income bracket increased, you know, post recession, even in 10 years after the recession. White families had bounced back. They still hadn't gotten to the wealth that they were at before the recession, but they were getting closer. And so for Latinx and Black families, that wasn't the case. Their recovery was happening, but it was happening at a slower rate. But what essentially it did is where there used to be, you know, what it basically did is effectively took median income earners that were like Black and Latinx families. Now, I'm sorry, I don't have like stats for Asian American families or for other racial or ethnic groups. But essentially Latinx middle income families, they were effectively pushed down back into the lower income bracket. So essentially Black and Latinx families were pretty much wiped out of the middle class, of what we consider middle class earning. And it's an arbitrary thing because, you know, what they classify as middle class is any family that of 2 adults and 2 children earning $45,000 to $150,000 a year. And that's a pretty big difference. So basically the recession, what it did is it pushed middle class families like Black and Latinx middle class families, it pushed them into the lower economic bracket and it kept them there. So it's basically just completely whitewashed what the middle class is. So I mean, that's just one way in which inequality is drawn on racial ethnic lines in this country. And just looking at the raw data, you can see that essentially the middle class doesn't exist for Black and Latin families anymore.
Can we?
And that's likely to get worse. You know, any of the gains we made in the past 10 years have effectively gone away, and they're going to keep getting worse. So like that reality is going to get even more stark. So it's something that I think that we should talk about. You know, the fact that income inequality is totally and completely tied to your racial and ethnic identity. So yeah.
I think one of the things we want to talk about today too is how I think I've had so many conversations about this in the past couple of years, and in particular in the last couple of months, but you know, we don't talk about money. It is, there are many ways in which talking about money for some people is inappropriate, or it's uncomfortable, it's, you know, it's embarrassing, it's all the things, it's all the emotions and all the psychology we hold into those conversations. And at the same time, Marvin, I feel like you know, I want to transition this to talk about the art sector and the theater field a little bit right now. But by not acknowledging and talking about what's happening in these systems, by not naming it for all of the reasons that it doesn't get named, we also are in a moment like this where we're like, oh my God, I mean, we're in a really rough spot. I think for freelance artists in particular, for folks not tied to an organization or institution. So maybe we can kind of transition this a little bit right now, and with this idea in mind that you've been talking about, which is, so let's talk about the theater field right now. What does it mean? What are the specifics that you're sort of seeing in this sort of already fragile and inequitable system? And so like when we threaten its existence like this, and therefore expose really where all the challenges are, what does it mean for freelance artists, and in your case, primarily as a playwright right now?
Well, yeah, you know, I don't know, like, it's so weird because like this is all happening so fast, and we're sort of trying to be like historians in real time, right? And we're trying to figure out what's going on like as it's happening, which is a really difficult thing to do. But I don't know, I feel like one thing I do want to talk about is like, I'm thinking about like the inequity in the theater, and just talking about, and actually divorcing the artists from that. And I think about all these big playhouses that are closing down, and the people that we're not talking about are like, well, who are the people that were cleaning these, like who was cleaning the Guthrie, right? Who are the people that were doing that? Who are the people that were working concessions or working at the box office? You know what I mean? It's just like on a totally anecdotal thing, I think of like when I go to the box office, it tends to be like, you know, elderly Americans that I see there. But, you know, how are those people sort of, how are they fitting into this? You know what I mean? Like, and it's one of the things that I think about, like just in terms of the economy at large, is like the people that we've suddenly just deemed as essential workers are usually people of color, like they were doing like the transit workers in New York, for instance. I was living in Brooklyn right before all this happened, and just thinking about like that inequality there, the people being put on the front lines. So, you know, I think like independent of just the artists who are going to be affected by this, there's like a lot of low-income people that are just helping the theaters just actually stay afloat, like actually stay open and operational. Like how is this going to affect their lives? In terms of like the artists that work there, I mean, like, you know, just thinking about being a playwright, I mean, we're at the Playwrights Center, just thinking about that. It's like, I couldn't afford to keep my New York apartment like during all of this. So I had to basically had to just like get the hell out of town. And like part of the reality of being a playwright is like, you got to go to New York, and you got like, if you want to like try to get a certain amount of success, it's like, you got to throw yourself in there and like network and glad hand, and, you know, do all that sort of the dirty work of like what it takes to be a playwright. You know, independent of just sitting in your room and writing this stuff. You got to put yourself out there, and you got to let people know that you exist. You know, how many, like, I was just thinking about like how many people are just being like forced out, like how many writers are being forced out in New York right now because they can't afford to live there. You know, and it's like, if you can extrapolate between, you know, who are the low income people like playwrights, and who are the ones that came from backgrounds that are higher income. I mean, if you're just looking at the basic data, you can just make the extrapolation and assume that it's going to be, you know, people of color that are most affected by that, you know? So it's just
So
another,
how do
to
you
me,
see
it
that
seems
play
like it's,
out though? Like keep taking that down the road a little bit, I guess, rather than, so yeah, we know like we have lots of people sort of say, well, it's easier for you to be in New York because like someone's paying for it for you. But what does that actually mean in the life of a playwright and the life of a freelance artist, but in particular the life of a playwright in terms of longevity or how long, as you're saying, you can actually just hang in there for it?
yeah, you know, I think that like this, the reality, and this is not based on any sort of data, but more just like sort of anecdotally what I've just observed being an artist is like, I think that, you know, there's so much talent out there. There's so many talented people. There's so many writers who could, who, given the opportunity, could, you know, write a really kick-ass show that becomes a hit. And, you know, sometimes it just takes, it takes fucking time to get there. You know what I mean? Like when you first write your first play, it's awful. And it takes a lot of time to just throw yourself into the mix and write something good. So it's like, it's basically like the people I think that make it, it's like, how long can you just be chewed up by the machine, you
Mm-hmm.
know, before you're like, let me out, I don't want to be in it anymore. And a lot of that is it's a financial reality, you know what I mean? It's like, how long can I be on this grind? You know, how many times do I have to put my actual career, like I could be working like a normal job, you know, I have the potential to be working in like an actual career, but I keep putting that on hold to like do this art thing. And like, how long can I stay in the game before I quit? You know what I mean? Or it's either before I quit or I write that hit, right? So I think that that presents a stark reality for writers of color because I can only speak for myself, but coming from a low income background where I don't have that sort of financial support coming from anywhere but myself and the income that I can make in any given year to support my art career, you know, that reality of having to make tough choices between, because eventually you're just like, oh, God, I just want to live in a nice apartment and like just give me a desk job, just give me that job, and like so I can just do that. I want a dog, you know, I want to be able to just like live in a nice neighborhood, and get me out of the grind of like trying to be a playwright. So I think that like there's so, and if you go to New York, you just see it, like, you know, without naming any names or anything like that, but it's like you just see it, you know, you can sort of tell like who's in there and who's got like some financial support coming from their family and who doesn't. And you know, it's you know, to be pretty much blunt about it, like it's always like white writers who, you know, like, oh, they come from a rich family, they don't need to worry about, they don't have work, they don't have to worry about work, they're just out there writing their plays and they can do it because they can afford to live there. I mean, that's just one of the realities of it. You know, another is like who gets into the pipeline of being a writer that is being noticed. You know, there's academic pipelines and there's professional pipelines. Is if you already grow up in the theater scene in New York, you just have a leg up ahead of people. So there's geographic inequalities. You know, like if you grow up in a part of the country that just doesn't have theater, you know, you don't grow up understanding how to operate in that world. You know, it's something that you have to learn, which I'm sure a lot of people of color can tell you. It's like you know, I grew up in like a bilingual home, speaking Spanish at home. My whole life, I had to like figure out like how do you exist in the white world? Like how do you exist in that space? I think I've gotten pretty good at that. You know what I mean? But that's another challenge I think that a lot of low-income people face is they're like, I don't even know how to speak the same language as all these like people talking about theater and all that, or you know what they're interested in. It's just like it's hard to sort of navigate that world. There's any myriad of ways that you can discuss like how race and ethnicity and how that's linked to income inequality, and how, you know, how those things present like tiny little challenges like on a day-to-day basis for an artist as they navigate through the world. I think that a lot of like white writers are just like not even aware that that's something that writers of color have to think about. But it's like,
You and I have talked about too, and I've heard from a lot of different writers over the years too, is also, you were sort of saying the how and the where, the when, and part of that pipeline conversation, the when is also can be a real challenge. in about, like, how do I enter the field, but also when did I enter the field? I did this whole other life because the reality of trying to be a professional artist was just like a joke. It was for people of a certain class or people of a certain race or culture. It was a thing that was not me. I experienced it, being in a certain lower class kind of growing up in that way. I got a job when I was 11. I've never not had a job my entire life. And for me, the idea, I got out of college having done theater and saying, but this isn't a real thing. No one can actually do it. There was a whole period of time where I was like, oh, I'm actually seeing people who actually like believe they're going to do theater for a living. And I wasn't 14 or 17 when that thing happened. It was later, and it was always with, working 3 jobs like so many people are at the same time as you're saying. But I think you're right. There is assumption built into a system that sort of says even how and when I get into this whole thing is, yeah, I'm not a writer coming into that when I'm 22. I'm a writer coming into that when I'm 27 or 28 or 32,
Yeah, and I think that like, this isn't just an issue between race and ethnicity, because I think a lot of women confront this as they're trying to become artists. They don't have people telling them over and over, like, you can do this, right? You're being told repeatedly, like, no, well, chances are you won't be able to do this thing that you really have a passion for. For me, I had this like weird, like romantic idea that like, no, like even though I came from these like low circumstances, that like this is America and I could be a famous writer, and like I could write I wanted to like go on the road and write an American novel like Jack Kerouac. That's what I wanted to do when I was like 12, when I first read On the Road. And so I just had this like romantic ideal that it could just happen. And then basically what happened is like, when the financial crisis hit like that, and I actually had to confront the reality of being an adult that needs to provide for myself, I was like, yeah, actually, no, that's just a pipe dream. And like, I didn't have anybody there like telling me, no, you can do this, you can do this. It was like, get a fucking job because you have rent and all this other stuff to pay. So that's what I did. And I don't know, like somewhere along the lines, like I sort of recaptured that romantic sort of ideal that like, this is something I can do. And that just came from myself. So, but I hear this from a lot from writers is like, I hear this a lot from like, from women writers that like, they have people like actively telling them that this is not something that they should be doing. And I think that that's the reality too for a lot of writers of color. It's like, kind of stay in your lane, that sort of attitude. And I do think that makes a difference. I think that like if you grow up in a privileged circumstance where you're told you can do anything you want, like, the confidence that comes with that's invaluable in an industry where you just have to exude confidence at all time in order to like to get success. It's like you need to go and talk to people and tell them, this is why you should do my show, and this is why it's a good idea. You know what I mean? And then that's a hard thing to pitch when, you've been told your whole life that, you're walking in shoes that don't belong to you, so that's a part of it too. Yeah.
Friends, in about just a couple minutes, we're going to go ahead and open it up for conversation and questions. So get your stuff ready. And a reminder that if you go ahead and look at the participants tab at the bottom of your screen, if you're interested in sharing or asking or talking to us, and then select the raise hand function in that, Julia is going to kind of create a queue for us, and then we'll kind of go through it as we go. And if you have any questions in the meantime, chat up Julia on the chat, and off we go. Marvin, I guess, as we kind of lead into the conversation, I'm curious. Obviously, there's no sort of.
I'm wondering.
Huh?
I'm wondering if I can like sort of like I think that like I got a little sidetracked from something you asked earlier that I think is like the most important thing, sort of that like when we were talking about what this discussion might look like. The most important thing that we sort of like kind of like talked about was like voicing the fact that like for people to like actually talk and speak about wealth, whether they have it or whether they don't. And I think that like it's when you start to think about like how is it possible for me to make systemic change as like one individual artist. Like it's a very daunting thing to like think about, like, how is it that we are going to make the gears that make this machine operate? How are we going to make them move in a different direction? That's like, it seems impossible, right? And I think that like one of the best things that that artists have done, you know, in the last years, the last 10 years or so or more, is to just speak openly about inequality as it relates to just, you know, as it relates to race and ethnicity, as it relates to gender, as it relates to sexual orientation. Like, you know, just making like people just like speaking up about that and making institutions consider it, you know, making them consider programming diverse seasons, making that part of their mission statement, getting organizations to change their mission statement to actually like think about including, you know, work for people with disabilities and work for people of color, that they're gonna produce those works of art. And I think that like we just, as a country, nobody wants to talk about like how much they make. You know, it's the reason like why growing up in a poor Mexican family, whenever we went to church, you know, my mom always wanted us to dress really nice so when we went out, we gave this impression that we weren't as poor as we actually were. And it's funny because like if you're in New York and you see all those trust fund artists, they wear like the dirtiest clothes you could possibly think about because they don't care, you know, like they don't think about that outward presentation of wealth. But it's almost like it's almost like they're shielding themselves from having to talk about the wealth that they do have. And I think that like there's a resistance both from people that come from low income backgrounds and from people that come from high income backgrounds to just not want to talk about the wealth that they have, like the lack of wealth that they have, and then the wealth that they do have. So I think that like that is the biggest reason why I wanted to have this conversation is just to be like, hey, this is something that we need to talk about. We need to talk about the fact that like people are coming into this industry and they're not coming into this industry from the same place. And a lot of people are starting it like right at the front door, and a lot of people are starting like way down the street, right? So just like talking about it and like being, you know, I wanted to like sort of lead by example, just be like, look, I come from a poor background. I come from like a low income background. My parents were really like working class, and like there's no shame in that. There's no shame in admitting it. It's just like something that I think that artists need to sort of normalize. And I think that the more that we sort of can keep this conversation in people's ears, especially artistic leaders, hopefully we can make them, you know, sort of like lean into like putting like being focused on supporting artists who come from low income backgrounds, which is, you know, disproportionately going to affect people of color, right? And getting them into the pipeline and being very conscious of that and writing it into their mission statements. And it starts with people just openly talking about the amount of money that they come from, which is like something that just in America in general, we just need to do more of.
Well, and I think, you know, Marvin, I was going to sort of say, what are some real practical suggestions? And as you're saying, even the beginning of talking real with one another, even though it is vulnerable and even though it has different consequences for different people, depending on where you are and all of that, it does start acknowledging what's actually happening in that inequity. And so that people who have some decision-making power are in a place to be able to say, oh, I have $100 I can invest. I'm going to, instead of investing 80 of it over here and 20 of it over for the artists, I actually need to look at that ratio because now I'm actually very clear about the artists that I'm inviting into my space and what I'm actually saying with that invitation, that power comes with it, hiring practices, compensation practices, and all of that as well. I guess my last question, and then we'll go ahead and Julia kind of queue up where we're at as a piece of this is, are there other ways? You sort of just talked about programming being another way, because for playwrights in particular, when you program that play, those ticket sales actually result in real dollars in addition to the advances going to the writers. Those ticket sales result in some amount of dollars, depending on the theater, going to a playwright. And talking about those disproportionately affected kind of folks, you know, in that system in that way. Are there other imperfect but forward-stepping solutions that you want to put out there?
well, nothing's a panacea. So even just like having a collective voice about something is not going to like, obviously, it's not going to be a tectonic shift. And it might be because, we should all be really inspired by what's happened with like certain movements that have occurred in the recent past, like the speaking out of women in the Me Too movement, how that is, it's affecting change in our culture. And then obviously we'd all want it to happen at a faster rate. But getting the conversation started is the thing that is moving things forward. And I don't want to suggest that you just start speaking about wealth and income inequality and all of a sudden that's just going to solve the problem. And there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. Like, I mean, I think I'm very inspired by, what like Trickle Up is doing, sort of raising money for people that are artists who are out of work because of the COVID crisis and who are also below the poverty line. I mean, and frankly, like the fellowships that the Playwrights Center offers. I mean, like when I received the fellowship, that was awesome. The financial sort of injection that I got from just getting that fellowship grant was great. And being someone who's worked in the nonprofit industry in, granting institutions where my whole job was as a development, like in development and communications, trying to get people to donate, trying to get private citizens to donate money to us so that we could grant it out to help artists, to help, I currently work for a nonprofit in St. Paul, where we work with low-income groups, communities, and we're a direct service provider to them. So one of the things we do is we just give them like we give low-income people like a $100 grant if their power is at risk of being shut off, which in Minnesota in the winter is like a huge thing, and that's great. Those are things that are like temporary solutions to systematic problems. So they're very helpful and like people are grateful for it. Like artists are grateful to receive these grants. I mean, I've always been very grateful the times when I've, have received that. But is it going to solve the problem? Like completely? Like that's not, no, I mean, like, no, the answer to that is like, it's not going to, and be like changing like a whole history of a country that's like, and a whole history of capitalism that's like based on something very ingrained in race and intertwined with that, and the subjugation of people based on race and the cruelty of capitalism that's come from that. That's a hard thing to alter, and like to talk about the theater being divorced from that system is like impossible. It's a part of the system. So I don't mean to like just these are not times where you should just like indulge in the gloom and doom of things, but should be realistic about it. And I don't know, frankly, I don't know, like, I would say that like something that I would like to see the theater do is to really make itself accessible to people that can't afford to go to it, and to make itself accessible to people in areas of the country where they can't even see it. So I, just thinking about how theaters can sort of rethink maybe who our audiences are and who we're bringing into our theaters, and giving that access to giving people that don't generally have access to the art, being able to give them that access, I think is something that could be important too. Just like changing the academic model of things and getting really having academia like sort of focus on the fact that things are inequitable and that we need to get more people in higher education from lower income backgrounds. And if you like, I used to work for the ASU Foundation at Arizona State University, and I'd like have to do research for this job and the things that I read. And one of the things that I saw was that higher education as a whole has become more diverse since the 70s. And that's largely because of the community college system. More people of color are in the community college system. But if you look at like the elite institutions like the Ivy League, they've actually become more white since the 1970s. So I think that like academia has a problem, like obviously it has a problem of of rooting out people from low-income backgrounds, and that affects people of color more than it affects white people. So,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know. There's any number of different things you can talk about, ways to like change the system, but it's only changing one cog in a giant machine.
But maybe a cog at a time, or 15 cogs at a time, or 27 cogs at a time starts to make some change. I want to go ahead and open this. We have a couple of people with hands raised. So Julia, let's go ahead and move over to our.
I think we had Noelle, and then Christina, and then Jenny. So Noelle, I'm going to give you permission to talk if you want to unmute.
Yeah, cool.
Leave.
I was just wondering, because we were talking about different solutions, and I feel like a lot of what I've observed in regional theater, or at least in funding models, are that it's usually like a top-down sort of model. Like artists and administrators alike are kind of brought up in this sort of nonprofit system where we're supposed to cater to donors who have a lot of money. And I think I guess part of what I'm thinking about in terms of change and how change can happen is the question of like how we're seeing some progressive politicians stick to like having a whole bunch of fundraising efforts from smaller donations and being really transparent about that. And I wonder on some level if the fact that artists and administrators and therefore institutions as a whole often need to cater to, in that top-down model, to these richer donors, if on some level that's part of why the inequality exists, because we're kind of prioritizing around what these donors want to see and what they're interested in. And they, because they have different life experience of being in a higher wealth bracket, have very different tastes than someone, you know, who like me, like grew up to, you know, 2 public school teachers. Like that's just a very different interest. So I think, I'm not saying like we should just throw up the entire system and not allow people who want to give money from wealthy brackets do it. But I do wonder if there's a way we can deprioritize those funds. And what both of you think about that sort of thing, because it's a big model, the nonprofit model, you know?
Yeah. I don't know. I just, having worked in the nonprofit industry and been a fundraiser, like I know exactly what you're talking about. Like these, you sort of like, it sort of becomes this thing where you just try to get as much money out of these films. You don't really care. You're just trying to like increase the amount of money that you're getting into the nonprofit. And then the people that give a lot, like they have a lot of say in what goes on there. So it's like, you're giving them a lot of, you're handing over a lot of power to these private, when you exchange in private donations. And the way that I think about it, I mean, I wanted to offer this as a solution, though I don't think it's going to happen, is like, if theaters were more funded on a public level, right, that would sort of level the playing field, I think. And the analogy I think of is like when you have public fundraising for campaigns, presidential campaigns. You don't have like all this like the interest of these private donors funneling into the platform that the candidate ultimately takes. Like that seems to me like that would also happen if you like made funding for the arts more public. Is that like the sort of interest, the artistic interest, and the sort of like the voice of the private donor, that, because you're right, like these nonprofit theaters, they rely on like private donations, and like often those donors are serving on the board, and so they do have sway about like what happens in that theater. If you made it public, if you made funding for the arts public, it might take care of some of that problems. Like, are we ever going to get to that point? I mean, like, you know, lots of theaters in Europe are supported through federal money, and then they make really great, cool stuff because they don't have to worry about like ticket sales and all that stuff. They just make really awesome theater. Like I would love to take that model up, but it seems very antithetical to what the American ethos is. So
I think also, Noelle, as you're saying it, partially it's about where do you deprioritize and where do you reprioritize? Where are those dollars, as you're talking about? Who are they going to? Where are they going to? And how are they being spent? But I think it's critical, Marvin, like we're talking about sort of wealth inequality, that we're also talking about power inequality, which is so much of what these kind of equity and inclusion conversations are about. Noelle, thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
I think, Christina, we're moving on to you.
Oh, hey.
Hey, Christina.
Hey.
So I guess what I'm thinking about with all of this is like, well then, what the F kind of plays should I be writing? Like, my work as an artist has gone more toward trying, like, seeing if I can challenge myself to write as accessibly as possible, meaning have a thought and an ear off the ground in my writing for low vision blind audiences, for deaf audiences, for and that's tending to result in more characters, like writing into my plays the people who will help make it more accessible. But like with the economy doing its thing right now, and who knows what it's going to be like at the end of this, like, should I just keep doing two people plays because that's what's going to be affordable about, for like, how is this affecting the kind of plays that we're going to be not only seeing, but like that will feasibly be produced in the future?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question because it's almost like I bullheadedly just like every time I sit down to write a play, I'm like, I'm going to write something that's producible. And then the thing that comes out of that is like the most unproducible play on the planet. So I have nothing to offer this, but other than like, you should just, I always say just like right from the gut, like what you feel, because if you're not doing that, then it's going to be dishonest. And when you write something that's dishonest, people they can tell, you know what I mean? So I think you should just keep writing the plays that you are writing. And I know your work, so I know that it'll work out for you, Christina. But maybe Jeremy has some advice for you.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's that. I think when we think about where privilege sits in this whole conversation and where we hold it as artists, and Christina, I'm not obviously talking about you in this moment, but I am talking to, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 playwrights a day or something like that, who are all asking the same question, which is, one of the questions is, how do I write? Why do I write? Really, why am I writing? Because who knows what I'm writing towards anymore? And some of that question, I think, is an artist question, which is the how or why, and all of the pressure to write and all of that stuff right now. And then the other question is what is going to happen to the theater field, which people don't know. But I think kind of going back to some of what Noelle was kind of proposing and talking about a moment ago, we don't know what that all is. I've been also talking to a lot of really, really visionary artistic leaders in the country right now. Not all of them are white, and not all of them are male, and who are thinking about actually that this is an opportunity. I don't know, I'm me, so I tend to really lean into my own personal belief and support in small and mid-sized theaters. I think about what Latinx Theater Commons is doing in terms of those theaters. I'm thinking about a lot of the theaters of color in this country right now. I'm thinking about a lot of the really amazing NNPN theaters that are in that sort of cohort. I'm thinking about theaters who have already for many years demonstrated a lot of the work that contains some of what you're talking about, Christina, that who aren't just going to suddenly say, well, I'm going back to reverting to doing all revivals from 1984 and then, you know, never the twain shall meet. I'll see you in 2025. I think there's still going to be, I believe I'm a hopeless romantic enough. This is where Marvin and I overlap. I believe that I am, as cynical as I am, I'm a hopeless romantic enough to believe in this generation of artistic leaders. When I think about people like Maria Goyanis or Hannah Sharif or Jacob Padron, I think about Lily Tongue Crystal, I think about these amazing artists that are, you know, Marissa Wolf, people that are, and Mariah C. Kaminsky, that are Stephanie Ibarra. I can't even stop thinking about all of them. That are taking over theaters and really being thoughtful about how work is going to end up on their stage. And I know that financially there is a crisis at stake, and that's true. And also my trust feels shifted when I'm in conversations with people right now. And Jamil Jude, who's on this call today, I just keep thinking of all the people that I'm talking to that I'm like, I believe in you. I believe in what you're going to do. You've lived through this in a kind of way that I am going to look to you as one of the people. And I think, Christina, you have so much to teach the world as an artist and as a playwright, and in particular in these last few plays that you're writing, that we will all find our way. I do trust that, well, I trust you a lot, as Marvin said. So I think there's different pieces of that, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Jenny, you had a question.
I am unmuted.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
Hi, Jenny.
So I've actually spent a lot of time and energy in the last year researching how to blow up the patronage system. Right? How can we, I've been talking with a lot of people over the last couple of months, but it's all been grounded in this research I've been doing over a year of how can we be better at distributing the power in performance making. How can we, you know, Marvin, you're talking about, you know, the folks who are who are vacuuming the theater seats as well as the artists. How can we build a different system in which everyone who plays their role in the bringing of performance to a community has equity in that thing that they've made, in a way that they can leverage it financially? How can we build a different model that's diversified in its income streams, not necessarily reliant on the patronage model, that grants and foundations, and that's what I mean by patronage, that patronage can be used to, when you need a leg up, when you want to try something new, but it's not the thing you rely on. How can we build something that is where the artists have ownership of the larger thing, so that even if you are spending 6 weeks intensively writing on a project in a room by yourself, you are still attached to an entity where other activity is going on that is bringing you a revenue stream? How can we all be diversified in our revenue streams and then all work together to build space and community that can serve all the people who bring their skills to it? These are the things I'm thinking about, and hoping that if, when we can share air again, that we can be ready and we can be better at creating a world in which all of the people who bring themselves to bear on live performance reap benefit from that, right? And so I guess my question is, these are all the things I've been thinking about. My question is, do you, Jeremy, as you're talking with other artistic leaders, what are some models that you've seen or experienced where people are really trying to sort of create a more of a hybrid system that lives in this ridiculous capitalist culture that we're in, but this is what we're in. So are there any models that you've come across, is my question.
I would not fully fleshed out models, I would say, in this last month, probably, as everyone is in full scramble mode. But what I'm hearing about in the short term are, what are the practices that organizations and institutions are wrestling with in terms of things like, are they paying out their contracts? You know, I'm thinking about Nataki Garrett and everything she's doing at OSF right now to be as thoughtful, not only with this pandemic, but around climate change and everything that she and the leadership are doing in terms of like how they're taking care of that company right now, and and transparency. And so I guess right now, rather than whole systems, what I'm hearing about is what could feel to some like small steps in an immediate way that address real life needs right now, so that there is a longer term conversation to get us, Jenny, I think back to the point that you're talking about in conversation. The questions I have are a little bit more like with anything that happens in life. Once we ease off from this moment, Marvin, as you were talking about what happened in those moments after the recession in 2008, what really then happens? Are we going to just fall back on systems, or are we going to be in such a tough place where actually people have to find new action, have to find new models, because frankly, they just aren't going to be able to behave with that amount of privilege as much anymore anyway? I don't know. So I think what I'm feeling emboldened by is watching some colleagues around the country say, yeah, it's not just about putting plays online. It's actually about how are we employing artists right now, or how are we saying, you know, I'm watching some grantors. We talk about sort of the granting and foundation system. I'm watching some really amazing foundations kind of reach out in certain ways to a bunch of organizations saying, we have to prioritize X right now. And some of that is about loosening guidelines around moving program dollars to gen up dollars, or is it about prioritizing individual artist dollars? Or there's lots of different things that I'm kind of seeing where at least the experimentation is happening. And I'm quickly just going back to a moment that Daniel Alexander Jones offered. So I credit Daniel with this, but when we had a conversation like this one a few weeks ago, right at the beginning of all of this, one of the things that Daniel really put forward is, well, look, I mean, we always said there was no more money to get out of the national federal budget, right? But suddenly there's like however many $1 trillion seem to just be able to be floated out there. So for better or for worse, like things that seem impossible are actually totally possible, and systems that seem broken, there's actually a possibility where real change could happen to do that. I think the question for me is, will people make that change? That's really, there's going to be a lot of factors weighing on all of those decisions. It's not easy, it's complex, but it's only going to happen when actual change happens. Marvin, as you're saying, when we actually start talking about things, when we actually compensate people differently, when we actually commit to a revision of our mission in order to produce plays, because it relieves both in terms of, you know, kind of addresses what stories are being seen on stage, who's allowed to see the stories on stage in terms of what the finances are, in terms of being able to see them and the invitation into those spaces, and also about, you know, kind of just general economic inequality around who's getting paid to have those stories be told. So it's step, I guess. When I am one person, but I'm in the conversations I'm in, I'm hearing a lot of steps that people are trying to take in very real practical ways. I don't know, Marvin, do you have another thought on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I kind of got, I do think that, like, just sort of like on a philosophical level, I think that, I think what you're talking about in terms of like change is like not something that just happens like, it happens like exponentially, but it happens in steps too. So it's basically like when the pressure of something builds up enough that it sort of breaks. So I think that like there's not one thing that you can do to sort of like as use as a panacea to fix everything. So it's like we were saying about experimenting with different things, different little things that we can do, and see if they work, and then continue to add to those little things until the pressure builds enough for it to like actually lead to something that's going to be an effective change. Yeah, and I'd be interested in hearing, you know, just, I don't know how much time we have like left in this. Like, I'm certainly not the most educated in like what would be the best practices is like leading from the leadership role, from the artistic leadership role. So I would love to hear from people who are artistic leaders that talk about that sort of thing. I only know what I can do as an artist. And one of the things that I always try to do is like bring my people along. So it's like whenever I get any sort of like thing that advances my career, I always try to bring some of my people with me, you know what I mean? To sort of like spread it out a little bit, and to make it a little bit more democratic. So I'm always sort of conscious as an artist, like with whom I'm working, and who I want to like come with me on this journey as an artist. That's just like a practical thing that I can do as an artist.
Yeah.
It's not much, but
Marvin, you're sort of asking if there are folks who are joining us today, whether you're an artistic leader, whatever, your other kind of leader, or you're however you are, do you have ideas, or are you seeing things, or are you trying things yourself somewhere within the art sector that you want to kind of put out on the table for folks that are actually potentially could make some longer term shift?
Yeah, and I think that like just that's what I was talking about, just having this discussion, and hopefully it's getting people to start thinking about different solutions. Not that we're sitting here having this discussion trying to offer all the solutions ourselves, but we're just keeping the discussion going so that people can talk about it. But I guess like not to like pressure anyone to like speak up or anything like that, but I'm just interested in hear what are some of the solutions that artistic leaders are going to come up with in the future to sort of deal with issues of equity and all that, and in particular how it relates to racial and ethnic inequality, and then like income inequality.
Yeah,
Go
ahead, Jenny.
Hey, so I just wanted to say, so I'll give you sort of a concrete example. So one thing that we're at the very beginning stages of trying to do is create a collective that has a specific revenue stream. And when I use the word equity, I mean financial equity, as well as racial and gender and sexual identity equity, et cetera, so that we can seed a group of artists with a revenue stream that is connected to concrete things, and then give them some resources and autonomy. And then ultimately, as this group of artists can build what they do together, they can in fact earn financial equity in the organization itself. And then of course there's great intention behind who you invite into that kind of circle, which is about racial and gender and sexual identity equity and ability equity and all of those things, getting all of those people and all of those experiences and all of those stories into a room. But what can that look like, and how much financial equity and can we wring, can we build in a model like that? So I guess in a way it sort of starts with an initial gift, which is the little bit of the patronage, right? Of a revenue stream that is active and ongoing, that then can be transformed into work that's offered into the world, so far on a free basis. But then how can we build that into something that can create financial independence for the artists? That is a model that I'm in the process of trying to make. So I'll just throw that out there.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you.
I mentioned this earlier, Marvin, so I'm just kind of putting it out to the group again, and then actually we'll start winding down the conversation today. So if you have anything kind of end of folks to say, but one of the conversations I've had, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 times a week right now is just to be thinking about the work that in particular, I think theaters of color have done historically in this country, and the ways that typically white or white-run theaters or white-funded theaters, as we're talking about today, are sort of getting dollars to kind of do a kind of work that these theaters have already been doing for decades and decades. And so I think there is a vulnerability right now around infrastructure, Marvin, going back to some of the things that you're talking about. So as I'm talking to foundations or, being in conversation with folks prioritizing and strategizing where effort and energy and dollars should go right now, it's a thing that, as you're saying, bring your friends along. For me, it's like I want to have 1 or 2 things at the top of my head around when I'm in these conversations right now, which I have privilege to be in some of these conversations, who are saying, how should we spend our money? And I'm like, oh my God, please support theaters of color right now a lot, and among other things. But that feels really, really critical again, in the sort of some of the small mid-sized conversations around people who are going to continue to do new work, people who aren't overburdened by a kind of infrastructure and overhead that will topple them in some kind of way in this moment, and who are telling the critical stories and have been telling those critical stories for decades. So I think there are lots of ways that we're kind of talking about in terms of how that funding plays out. I think that's going to continue to be a thing for the next few years in particular. I'm going to start to bring us to a close because it looks like we're good with our questions. Marvin, do you have anything that you want to kind of end us on today?
Yeah, no, I just, yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and it's great to see, just looking on the list, you know, some people whose names I know just like through reputation, but some people that I know very personally, and it's, thank you all for just, you know, listening or participating in the conversation. Yeah, the only thing that I sort of want to end on is that, like, we just kind of just keep this conversation going. Like you were saying earlier, you know, there is an immediacy of things that we need to take care of right now, and I think, you know, getting money to artists who are out of work and all that sort of stuff is like critically important, like, you know, something that we definitely need to be focused on. But like, they're just sort of keeping this, you know, like that we've been making strides in the American theater of like actual inclusion and diversifying and all of that. And if we keep talking about how we can do better and how like how we've been doing a good job and how we can continue to do better, not like lose focus of that. And it's hard to do in these periods of crisis because you sort of get overwhelmed by everything that's just going on in the world, you know what I mean? Or if you're losing your job, like that becomes like the only thing that you're concerned about. So I would just invite all of the artists who've participated in this conversation to just keep the conversation going yourselves in your little groups. One thing that I like, when you do have the privilege to be in conversations with people that might possibly be able to affect change, that you are bringing this stuff up. And just one thing that I have personally done, and I don't know if this is going to serve me well at all, but like just in my applications as a playwright, trying to get fellowships and all that sort of stuff, the ones that I've recently filled out, you know, so, like I won't name what the institution was, but one of the questions was like, and do you have like anything else to say? And then I went on this long rant about income inequality and all that sort of stuff. So just, you know, putting it into people's ears, like I was like, I have the privilege right now to speak directly to the leaders of this theater. So I'm going to use this opportunity to say something. So I just, hopefully all of you can do that in the way that you can, within the sphere of influence that you have. Keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you all. It's been so great being in conversation with you today. Let's, as you're saying, keep the conversation going. If you do want to join us for more of these kinds of conversations, again, hang out at pwcenter.org and click on our spring season, and you'll find a lot more ways of engagement going forward. I do want to just pitch out that although it's pretty sold out, intensely sold out, Stacey Rose's Legacyland is this Friday in a reading, and with the original director and cast from the production that closed on opening night at Kansas City Rep, the amazing Kansas City Rep, and we're thrilled to be able to present that and really put those plays out into the world right now, speaking of things we can do to create a little more equity. So please join us for that if you're able. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you all with us. We really appreciate you spending your vital time and energy with us, and we wish you much love and health. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at the Playwrights Center. We are here for you. Thank you so much, friends.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.